This is a 93, and my daughter had this car out the other day. It was pretty hot. It was over 90 degrees, and she was in slow-moving traffic. And she pulled the car to the side of the road and called me and told me the car is overheating. So I told her to turn the air conditioning on, and that brought the temperature down. The reason is because when you turn the air conditioning system on this car, it turns the cooling fans on. Now, the factory settings on this car allow the engine to get up to 235 degrees Fahrenheit, but I think that's too hot. I really don't want this car to run over 200 degrees on a hot day in slow-moving traffic. And here's how I went about making that happen. So this is a 94, and I've already given this one the cure, and I have a 2004 out there, which I did the same thing to. And the steps that I took eliminated any chance of the car overheating. I'll show you what I've done. On this car, it's basically three things. I've replaced the stock radiator with a DeWitt's high capacity radiator. I've swapped out the thermostat with a 160 degree thermostat, and I've had the control module reprogrammed to turn the cooling fans on at a lower temperature. And here's how I went about doing this. Was you got to, in order to pull this old radiator, stock radiator out, take this off. There's two. You got to just take these two off. You don't have to do the third one in the middle. Hose clamp here, plug here. This comes off. Okay. Now, on the 94, which is really basically the same thing, I tried taking the radiator out by just taking the top of this case off. This case is two pieces. There's a top piece and a bottom piece. And you can unfasten the top piece from the bottom piece. And hopefully you can pull out the stock radiator and put the new one in without having to pull the bottom part of the case off. That didn't happen. I'll tell you why. Is I could not pull the top half of this off without disconnecting the air conditioner lines here. For love nor money, I could not maneuver this piece out without taking these off because they interfered with the bottom flange here. So you've got to do that. Now, once you do that, get these lines broken loose, you really don't need to unfasten the top case and the bottom case. You can pull the whole thing out as one unit. And there's a couple of advantages to that. So here's what you do. You pull this off, break the air conditioning lines here. This comes off. There's a plug down there. You can loosen. There's a plug right there. You gotta disconnect. You gotta break this loose. I think this is the accumulator or the evaporator. I'm not sure exactly what this gadget is called. You break this loose, break that line loose. These are the tools I use to disconnect these flare nuts on the air conditioning lines here. This one breaks loose. This one hold back up on. This is connected to this tube here. Don't try to turn this one. This one you crack loose. Same with the bottom. So these I use the crescent wrench. Let me get those tools wrong. These I use the 1 1/16 open end wrench and a large crescent. And this nut breaks loose. Once you get that loose, also you want to, there's a hose clamp down there with a 10 millimeter nut and screw on it. Break that loose. You want to have a little more play in this air conditioning line. So once you get that loose, there's a bracket down here. You got to loosen the clamp of the bracket. This pulls out. Then you got to pull the bracket out. There's a 10 millimeter screw under here that once you move the air conditioning line out of the way, you can get that out. And there's two 10 millimeter screws. The bracket comes out. Get that out of the way. Let's go over to the other side, okay? These are the cooling fan relays. They're held on by two 10 millimeter screws. Unscrew them, pull it out, and set it around here, over to here, get that out of the way. You got to take the upper radiator hose off. On the other two cars, you have to you have to disconnect and remove the entire control module and send that out to have it reprogrammed. That's what I did. There's a couple ways to go about this. Either you can tune it yourself, buy a tuner, or have somebody else do it. What I chose to do is I chose to take it off, take it out, and then have it sent out and have a guy retune it for me. I'll go over that with you in a second. Now, to get this off of here, you loosen these two nuts here, and there's a third 10 millimeter nut under here that you got to remove completely. And this just kind of pulls out. And then here, there's a plate here that you have to unscrew. There's actually 4 screws here that hold this in. You take these out, the 4 screws, that's a 1/4 inch socket. This comes off. Now all you have to do is pop this module out of here. There's 2 little brackets here. You push them down, pull them apart, and push them down with your thumb, and this little module will pull right out. That's all you have to send out. You don't have to send the whole unit out. Just that one little blue module here. Okay? And I'll show you where to send that off. Now, once you've got all that stuff connected that we talked about, you want to pull this whole thing out as a unit, including the top case and the bottom part of the case, and the cooling fan shroud and the cooling fans will all come out as one unit. Now, in order to get it out, there's 2, I think they're 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter bolts, one here and 2 on the other side. These nuts, the place where the nuts are, you see that? They hold the 2 halves together. Don't disconnect that. There's one here and one back over here, and there's 2 on the other side. Leave them connected because, as I mentioned, you can pull the whole unit out. You disconnect 1, 2, 3, 4 of those 1/2 inch 13 millimeter bolts out, and then the whole unit will come out. But there's a couple things down below you got to disconnect. We'll go there now. Okay, so here we are into the car, and I'll show you what you got to disconnect in order to get the unit out. The whole thing is a unit. Under here, there are these nuts here. You got to take these off. This piece has to come off. There's these here. You got to pull these off. On top, it's a Torx T30. And at the bottom, it's 10 millimeters. Take those nuts off. Disconnect these 2 here. Those across there. Now, this piece of plastic underlaps this piece of plastic. So you got to take some of these screws out here, enough where you can drop this piece here down in order to pull this piece out. It's actually pretty easy. Okay, so this is going to come off. Now, here's another thing you got to do. They have these little pieces of plastic in here. These little pieces here. There's a piece of aluminum that holds on this piece of plastic here. They're held onto these little plastic push nuts here. You got to get this in here and pull those out. These have got to come off. Those have got to be unfastened. Now, these little plastic push pins are in there pretty tight, and if you're not careful, you can bend this piece of aluminum pretty easily. And if you notice what I've done to these, I used to put a piece of protective plastic on this little tool here, just to keep it from marring any kind of a surface. So these are hard to pull out without bending this. So what I did is I pulled them out just far enough where I could get a pair of dikes on and clip them. And then I pushed the end out the other way, and these pieces came out. You gotta pull these 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces out. So we've got this off, we've got those off. Now under here, you gotta do a little bit of work under here. You've got to disconnect the fan motors. There's a plug here and a plug here, and then these fasten to the case by these wire connectors. You got to disconnect one here, and you got to disconnect one here, and then pull the cable well out of the way so it doesn't get hung up on anything. Also, while we're down here, this is an automatic, so it has a transmission core lens going into the radiator here. So you got to break that loose here. And I used a 1/2 inch flare nut on that cooler line to break that loose. You got to cut this line out of the way and to clear all this stuff. And you got to do the same to the upper transmission line. So you have everything disconnected under here. You're ready to pull out. Let's drop it down again. A couple more things I want to go over from the top. Okay, we're back on top. Here's the, if you have an automatic, here's the transmission core line. You got to break that loose again with that 1/2-inch crow's-foot flare nut. Once you get all this done, try to pull everything out of the way. It takes 2 people to pull this thing out, and it'd be helpful if you had a third person that helped pull these lines out of the way while you pull the whole unit out. Okay, now there's another thing I've done is the coolant in this car, the antifreeze in this car, I believe was the original antifreeze, which is, it's pushing 30 years old. This is a 93, almost 30 years old. And I decided to, let's change out the antifreeze. So now, naturally what you want to do, a couple things I forgot to tell you. Of course, drain the radiator first, okay? And also, seeing how you're working on something electronic, disconnect the negative side, negative terminal of the battery, which is right over here. It's a 5/16 wrench. Take that. The first thing you do in the job, disconnect the battery, drain the radiator. Now, once you have the radiator out and you drained it and everything, there's still quite a bit of antifreeze left in the engine block. Now, how do you get that out? Well, there's a couple ways to go about that. What most people do is on the bottom of the engine block, there's these two gadgets called knock sensors. And if you pull them out, it will drain the engine block. I didn't do that. I think I found an easier way to do that. Once you have this out, this whole unit out of the way, you have really very easy access to this upper radiator hose. So what you do is you radiator, take the cap off the radiator, and disconnect the thermostat housing, take the thermostat out. It won't work unless you take the thermostat out because it won't allow the fluid to be pulled out of the engine block. So what you do then is with that upper radiator hose off, and this completely out of the way, as I mentioned, there's a lot of room there. It allowed me to stick this wet dry vacuum. You got to pull the filter out of the vacuum if you're going to vacuum out by liquid. I put this right into the upper radiator here. It made a nice snug tight fit, held it there, and turned the vacuum on, and it pulled all the antifreeze out of the engine block without having to, mess around with disconnect the knock sensors. It actually worked. It worked pretty well. So that is to me the easiest way to do it. Just hook the wet dry vac up to the upper radiator hose, thermostat housing, take that off, pull the thermostat out, take the cap off the radiator. And then what I did is I just hooked a hose up to the wet dry vacuum and sucked up any remaining fluid that was in the reservoir here and the reservoir down here. I just took the cap off and sucked up all the fluid in there. That way, all the old fluid is out of the system. It actually takes quite a bit of antifreeze. I think I put about 3 gallons of antifreeze back in this thing. So let's move on here. This is where I got the radiator. I got it from Speedway Motors, and I've used them quite a bit before. They stock all the stuff, and they ship it out like immediately. You get it just in a couple days, and there's no shipping on these. So that's why I use Speedway Motors to get these as I mentioned, they stock everything. And I'll show you what number it is for the C4 Corvette. For the automatic, 93 automatic, it's this number right here, 32-1139090A, A for automatic. And then for the 94 manual over there, it's the 321139090M for manual. By the way, these prices, I believe, have gone up since then. So that's the radiator. The 160 thermostat I put in is a Mishimoto MMTS-GM 92L for 92 to 96 Chevrolet Corvette. There's that. Here's where I had the control module sent out to be retuned. This guy knows what he's doing. He's done a couple of these for me before, and he does a really good job. His turnaround time is very quick. I had it out to him, sent it out to him, in a couple of days I had it right back. It's Long's Performance Engineering of Vancouver, Washington. The guy's name is Tom. As I mentioned, I've been very happy with his work so far. He retuned these perfectly. They go on at the right time and off at the right time, and the temperature of the engine never goes above 200 degrees. It's not that expensive. It's $125 plus the shipping and the tax. This one came out to be $144. So there you have everything. Putting it back together is pretty much reverse order. Again, what I did to get it out easily, set a piece of cardboard up here and had two people lift it up and sit on the cardboard, and then the other person came around and we pulled it off there. Do the same thing. We put it in. I set it on here first, a piece of cardboard, and then they went around the other side and we dropped it down in there. And the third person made sure that all the lines were out of the way, so nothing got bent or kinked. And as I mentioned, you're going to have the radiator recharged. Now, one thing I want to tell you about this is a transitional year between where they went to the R12 to this newer version called I think it's 134. And on these cars, this happened to be the newer stuff. So on the older stuff, the R12, was originally an R12 system. They've got to do some other stuff to it. They've got to replace some of the parts and some of the seals. I don't know exactly what it is, but this one had the newer refrigerant in it, so I didn't have to do that. The instruction sheet for the installing this radiator calls for one modification that you have to make to the upper radiator cushions, both of them, the right and the left. What you have to do is you have to cut away 1/4 of an inch off the rubber here to accommodate the thicker radiator. Now I've already done it to this one. As you can see, I've made a very nice clean cut. And what I've used to do that is I've used the table saw. I mean, you could use a hacksaw or knife, but I don't think there are many tools that are going to make a nice clean cut like this one does. So let me show you how I did that. What you do first, you set this on there and you bring the blade up to where it's just touching the top surface here. That's the right height for the blade. Then what you do is you bring this in until, I haven't cut this one yet, until the blade is just touching there, and bring the fence against it. Find out where that is, and then on the fence here, move it over 1/4 of an inch. And that'll take exactly 1/4 of an inch off of this thing here. So let me demonstrate how to go about doing this. So what I do is I bring it against the fence there until that's just touching, and that'll take 1/4 of an inch off of that. Then what I did is I put a clamp here to keep it in place. Okay, here we go. Now, seeing how we have to cut 1/4 of an inch off and the blade is only 1/8 of an inch, now I've got to move it over to take the rest of the cut there. I got to cut that center piece out there. I might have to take a couple cuts to do a nice neat job, so let's go through that real quick. Here we go. And as you can see, it did a nice, neat, clean job of cutting that back a 1/4 of an inch to accommodate the thicker radiator. They're both done now. That's it. That's the only modification you got to make to these cushions. Okay, you'll find that when you fit this thing together, even with the spacer that they supply, there's a plastic spacer in there, it pulls this shroud or fan shroud away from the body and the radiator. But it still hits, the fan shroud still rubs against the radiator right through here, or else it did anyhow. You don't want that because the vibration of the car is going to wear through these little thin tubes here. So what you got to do is you got to cut that back. And I'll show you how I went about doing it. And it seemed to work pretty well, and I think it did a fairly neat job of it. So here's what I did. Here's the spacer. I took a square, and I went around, and I marked a full 1/4 inch of an off. Full 1/4 inch mark here, all the way around. And then I connected them with the tape so I had a nice bright line to go by for the cut. And then I took this little Dremel tool. I had somebody hold it for me while I cut through the plastic all the way around. Taking a 1/4 of an inch off all the way around. And here's what I cut off. It makes a pretty rough finish. And what I did is I just cleaned it up with some sandpaper. Okay, now when I put it together, there's about at least 1/8 of an inch between the fan shroud and the radiator, so I'm not going to run into any trouble with the fan shroud coming in contact here. Okay, so I finally got this car all buttoned up. You know, in the Pacific Northwest for the last couple of weeks, it's been really, really hot, unseasonably hot. And I had it out in temperatures that was well over 100 degrees. And even in slow-moving traffic, the temperature didn't budge over 200 degrees. So what I did, it seemed to be successful. Now, one thing that I had to do was, it's not done yet, it's got to go to the garage to have the refrigeration done on it, the air conditioning system. It's one thing I'm not an expert at, and I don't have the equipment to do it. But apparently, the system in this car is kind of a transitional time between R12 and R134. And this car had R12 in it, and it needs to be converted. Some of the components need to be swapped out, the seals or whatever. And it's going to cost about $250 to do that. So that's one downside to it. It's kind of expensive to have the air conditioning system converted over to R134. So I guess that's really about it. If you drive your car in hot climate and slow-moving traffic, you don't like the way it's overheating, you might want to go this route. So take care and good luck with the job.